This is in a way continuation of a previous video where I was talking about how to master agentic AI development. And one of the tip that I had given, which was a last tip, is using MCP servers in the development workflow. And apparently people wanted to know about MCP servers. If you are looking at the agentic development, one of the buzzword definitely that you will come across is MCP server, that is model context protocol server. Now what is this MCP server? Why do we use it? How it works? How it changes the overall development workflow? What is the larger impact of this MCP server? That is what the main focus of this particular video will be. Let's assume that I have a local MongoDB database and I want to query this particular database. Let me show you how I would have done as a manual way, and then we will see how to do it using the MCP server. So let's do that. I have a terminal open here and I have a database here, and if I just say show collections, it basically shows all the tables or collections that are there in this MongoDB. And if I want to see what are the actors that I have here or movies, I can say db.movies.find pretty, and that will give me movies that are there. I can pretty much do the same thing actors. Instead of movies, if I search for actors, find and pretty, that should give me the list of actors. Now in this case, I am pretty much doing all the manual querying of the database. Now if I give this particular structure to the Copilot, then it should be able to give me the query. So let's do that. So let me open the VS Code and go to the chat window here, that is Copilot, and I have selected ask, and I can say here is the MongoDB database collection. The name of the collection is actors. I am giving you the structure of the actors collection, and give me the query to fetch the actors whose gender is male. And if I give this particular query, it should give me a query which I can copy to the terminal again, and I should only fetch those actors who are male. The problem with this particular approach is it is very restrictive in nature. I have to give the structure to the Copilot every time I want to ask it to generate the query, and then I have to copy paste it in the terminal to fetch the things. And when you are doing the agentic development, looking up the database table, trying to understand the structure is very common thing, and you don't want to do this in a very manual way. So if there was a capability for the LLM, in this case Copilot, to figure this out, the database and queries on its own, then it would have been very easy. And that is where the concept of MCP servers comes into picture. So I will quickly show you how to set up a MCP server for a MongoDB database. So this is the MongoDB database that is already running on my machine. And to access the content of this particular database, I will now set up a MCP server. So what I can do is go here, extensions, and you can see there are installed extensions, recommended extensions, and MCP servers. So right now there are no MCP servers installed here, so that is why it says that nothing is here, and you can click on this MCP servers to bring in extra tools. So let me click on this, and I am basically navigated to this particular page. And if you see here, there is a MCP server for the GitHub, Figma, Playwright, Sentry, Microsoft Docs, and as you can go on and on and on, there are a lot of MCP servers. But as I told you, right now I am only interested in the MongoDB. So let me just quickly search for Mongo. Yeah, there is a MCP server here. So what I will do is I will click on this particular install MongoDB. So I will click allow. So that should automatically start showing here in my VS Code, and I will click on install, and now this thing got installed, and now I can click here and start the server, and suddenly you will start seeing that in the terminal certain comments are coming. So it says that discovered around 20 tools. So it is also starting the server to the MongoDB, and it has got connected to it. Looks like everything is set up. So now what I can do is I can go into the agentic mode in the Copilot, and if I ask the agent, you should be able to figure out there is a MCP server installed which is connected to the MongoDB, and using that I can get the information that I want. Let me just increase the font size. Let me just ask here how many collections are there in the DB. Let me give the DB name. So let me copy paste the DB name here. The DB name here is sample 90s Indian cinema. So let me just give enter, and now agent has started working on this, and now it automatically connects to the MCP server, and then it figures out that it can connect to the database. So it is asking, once you provide the connection string, I can connect to the list the collections from the sample DB Indian cinema. I can say there is no password, you can attempt connecting using MCP. And as you can see, it figured out there are 3 collections in the database, that is movies, directors, and actors. I can simply say how many movies are there in the movies collection. And as you can see, I am now saying everything in a very natural language, and it basically figures out what it means and then creates the necessary query and fetches the information. I can say, give me the name of the director who has directed a movie called Border. It should be able to figure that out. Let's hope that, yeah, it's correct. It is JP. So this is what MCP server makes it possible. Even though visually this looks very simple, a lot of things are happening behind the scene. So let us now try to understand the overall to and fro of data flow that is happening as we were doing this. So when you were looking at the flow, the things that you can clearly identify as the main actors in the whole flow are your Visual Studio, your Copilot, and then the MongoDB. Other than this, there is another thing which is MCP server, which sits between your Copilot and MongoDB. So let us now try to understand the flow that is happening. So when you enter your query, fetch some data in your chat prompt in the Visual Studio, that is basically sent to the Copilot, and it basically contains the prompt and the context. So in the agentic workflow, you can also give a lot of context, the name of the file that you are referring to, the context of the database that you are referring to. In our case, it was fairly simple, so we did not provide much context, but still we gave some context in the query itself that I am asking from a particular database or a particular collection. So that is the context you can think of. So once you send this to the Copilot, Copilot is nothing but your LLM, large language model. So it needs to decide, how do I get this data? Should I use some kind of a tool? And if it decides that it needs to use a tool is nothing but your database. Once it decides that it needs to get it from a tool, then once again the information is sent back to the Visual Studio to fetch a particular tool, and it provides all the data to the Visual Studio, that is the client application. And then the client application, nothing but the Visual Studio, then sends all that information and forwards that information to the MCP server. MCP server is the one that we had installed for the MongoDB. It knows how to work with this particular tool called as MongoDB. So MCP server then basically goes to the MongoDB and executes the operation. And from there, it is fairly simple database fetch operation. So the MongoDB basically executes that particular query and returns the data, and that data the MCP server returns to your MCP Visual Studio. So whatever the result that you have from the MongoDB, it is now available with the Visual Studio client application. And then this result that it might have got might be very database format, but LLMs can process that database format and give back the information in a natural language. So to get that, once again Visual Studio sends that information, whatever the stream result that it has got from the MCP server, to the Copilot, which is LLM, and LLM then understands the whole thing and returns back the response in a natural language by composing it in the natural language. So this is what the whole flow is actually happening. Now, why this MCP server with the agentic workflow changes significantly everything. Here we are using the terms like Visual Studio, Copilot, MCP Server, and MongoDB. But if you go beyond our development paradigm, then it can be anything. So if you start going through the documentation of the MCP Server, then the terms are not really Visual Studio, Copilot, MCP Server, and MongoDB. This is very one particular application of MCP Server in the development using Agentic AI. But this basically opens up the possibilities in the way applications can be built. Visual Studio is nothing but a client application. So it can be any host, any client application. It could be even your browser. Copilot is your nothing but any LLM, large language models that are out there. It could be OpenAI's ChatGPT, Cloud, Google Gemini, anything for that matter. And then MCP server, the nomenclature that you will find for the MCP server is a adapter. In a fairly simple term, it is an adapter that can talk to multiple tools between the LLM. And then MongoDB is nothing but a resource. That's what it is. So if you think about this structure, then the way applications can be built completely changes. For example, think of banking application. It has a resource and you have a MCP server, and you don't really need a website at all to get your account details. You can just ask a simple natural language query to a LLM. LLM figures out this is a person who is asking for account details and say transaction details, and it figures out which MCP server it needs to talk to, and MCP server talks to the backend of the banking application, and the data is fetched back and you basically get your response. And if this is possible, then there is really no need for all these fancy websites and mobile applications. I'm not saying that those things are going to be dead in a couple of months, but the reality is this is where the world is going. So this is how MCP server basically changes everything about the way we interact with the backend database, and it also changes the way you can do the agentic development much more easily using MCP servers. Now, before I end, I just want to show you a couple of more things about MCP server. Earlier, when I installed the MCP server, this is where I installed from. So this is the official web page of the Visual Studio where they have provided, and recently they have introduced this particular plugin using which you can install these MCP server very easily. And these number of MCP server that you are seeing here might not be sufficient. So what if you want more MCP servers which are not listed here? You don't have to worry. Just go for GitHub MCP servers and you should find out whole list of MCP servers that are there here, and it goes on and on and on and on. You can just go through any documentation, and using that particular documentation you can figure out how to set up the MCP server. For example, let's assume that I have a file system. This basically allows you to access the file system on your machine if MCP server wants it. So how do I set up this particular MCP? One thing is go through this particular documentation painstakingly and do it, but another easier way is ask the agent to do it. Copy the URL, go to the VS Code, go to the context window here and say fetch URL. So you are basically telling the Copilot, go here, this is the URL that I am giving based on the documentation available here in the URL provided. Set up the MCP server for file system and sit back and relax. It will go there, it will figure out what needs to be done, and all you have to do is just approve, understand what it is doing, and that should be it. So you can see that it created a MCP JSON file, and it is also giving you a very detailed explanation of what all things you can do once this MCP server is installed. That's it. And now let me just reduce the thing, and here is the MCP server for the file system. So hope that this makes MCP server much more easy to understand, and Let me know if you have any questions and clarifications. Please drop them in the
Brings us
comments.
to the end of this particular video. Don't forget to like, comment, share the video and subscribe to the channel. Take care. Bye.